Melissa, I'm very excited to have you here. I was thinking about you and your background. I know you live in Boston and you've been based in Boston. And I also know you've been in the product space for 2 decades. And I don't know how to explain the fact that you've been in product leadership for that long. And I was in Boston for 20 years, but it's only been the last year that we've met. I don't know how that happened, but I'm thrilled we have. For a brief introduction for everyone, as I mentioned, Melissa's been a product leader for 20 plus years. I'm a big fan of her work. She's co-author of the excellent book that I just recently read, Aligned Stakeholder Management for Product Leaders. And Melissa has worked at many different product organizations, including Wayfair and Enernoc. One thing I didn't share with you, Melissa, is that one thing I hope to talk to you a little bit about is that I know you've just most recently made the transition from being in-house as a product leader, and now you're operating more as a product coach. If we do have time, I'd love to talk about that as well. But to start, thank you for joining. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to start out, I shared a little bit of a brief background on your experience. Can you share a little bit about your career trajectory and what's brought you here?
Yeah. So I've spent about 20 years in product and I had some stints in UX research there too along the way. And I've been at companies of various sizes and stages, but primarily in the B2B space. And I actually have an undergrad degree in mechanical engineering. So I've gravitated towards products that have a physical component or process component. So I've worked in manufacturing and supply chain, warehousing, and at Enernoc with energy, electricity management, which included physical devices to measure electricity in various places. That's what drew me there. And then I worked at Wayfair for 5 years and then made a transition to product coaching and advising, which I am enjoying a lot. It's the things I like the most about management without having to be responsible for the business results.
Absolutely. I hadn't realized, thank you for sharing about your background. I hadn't realized you had a degree in mechanical engineering. I wonder, when you talk about your background in product management and also user research, how did you make that transition from your degree? How did you make the transition to product?
It was actually through industrial design. So in undergrad, I went to Cooper Union in New York City, and they have 3 degrees: engineering, art, and architecture. And so I have a degree in engineering, but I took a lot of classes in the art school. And then I discovered industrial design. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon for grad school for a degree in product development, essentially, which was mechanical engineering, industrial design, and the business school. So there I goddess for the broader business and also how
Mhm.
kind of the technology and the people in the business come together, which is how I generally explain what product management is.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I told you, and I'm not just saying this because you're on the program, I loved the book. And one thing that I especially loved, if folks haven't had a chance to pick up Bruce and Melissa's book yet, it's excellent. One of the key themes that I really loved, Melissa, was the focus on the people in-house and the personalities and the dynamics that come into play as a product leader and how you have to navigate those dynamics. I'm seeing a lot in the product world. Yes, it's very important to be focused on methods and how we approach our product work, but it was really refreshing and enlightening to hear your perspective on the product leader's role is also to deal and navigate those dynamics. And I'm curious, I'm thinking back in my career, I can think of some stories and failures along the way. I didn't learn this when I first started out in product and UX. I did not learn this lesson. It took me a few times to realize,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about, did you reach here very early on in your product career
Well,
or?
I think it took a little while, but one of my early stories in my first product role, my first real product role, I was working with an engineer and we were having a lot of trouble agreeing on what we should be doing with the product. He had built the product, so it was like his baby. And before I came on board, there were several people who tried to work with him and got frustrated. So there was like a designer who was working with him, and there was like a back and forth, and the engineer was editing the specs to match what he had actually done. And so like the designer locked the documents so he couldn't get into, there was like this whole thing. So of course they hand this big mess to the newbie who's coming. And I'm like, okay, this is super interesting, learning about the dynamics, trying to figure out the history of the product. And what I ended up doing was I decided that the reason that he didn't trust anybody else's input is that he hadn't actually seen the customers use it. So I took
Interesting.
him on some customer visits with me, and I had them tell him his baby was ugly instead of me. Right. And so he saw them use it. He saw them struggle with it. He saw person after person ask the same questions and get confused by the same things. And then we got back and he's just like, okay, I think I get it now. Right? We had that sort of shared experience. And from then on, he's okay, I understand your method that you use to come up with these designs. Therefore, now I trust new designs because I know what you've gone through to get there. So I understand that it's researched and that it's based on something and not just personal opinion.
Okay. I see there being another key component that you brought to the conversation with this colleague where you invited him into the process very
Yeah.
early on when you got there. I'm curious, thinking back to that story, I've heard from product managers, user researchers that sometimes it's tough to even involve your partners if there isn't that level of trust. Was this colleague willing to go out to customer visits right away, or did it take some finesse over time?
He was willing to go. I had to train him on how to be an observer, right? So customers were like, how does this work? And my natural inclination, how do you want it to work? What do you expect? But it works like this. And you're like, no, don't do that. You want to
Wait, is
understand
that
what
not what you're
it
supposed to do in a research session,
is.
Melissa?
Yeah. So I also at this same company, I came in, and this was after my degree at Carnegie Mellon, where it was really an interdisciplinary degree.
Mhm.
And I came into this company, I'm like, okay, how do you figure out what you're going to work on next? And my manager, who's the director of product management, said, oh, the engineers tell us what we should be doing, and then we go do it. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
Mhm.
How do we know it's the right thing to do? He's, oh, good question. And I basically helped introduce a discovery portion of the process. And I was working a lot with the UX designers who at that time were transitioning their department name from usability to user experience. It was the beginning of that kind of transition. And I encouraged the team to present their discovery research. This was an annual waterfall cycle, so it was like a time for this, to everybody who was going to be working on it. QA, documentation, engineering, like all of these different stakeholders who had never been part of this conversation before.
Mhm.
And I found an immense amount of value to bringing people at the beginning, like, here's the vision, rather than here's the product, go document it for the technical writers.
Yeah.
And they actually had some really interesting feedback as far as what we were learning and what we were doing. And I hope that, my colleagues were able to see the value of bringing in people early and not just bring the UX designers in at the end and make it pretty.
Absolutely. Okay. So I have a little case study. Again, we didn't talk about this, Melissa, but one thing I really liked about your book was the thread and the story and narrative throughout the book, where you and Bruce walk through who the players are within the organization. And you have, I don't know if you describe it as the star or the protagonist, Irie, hero. And I really loved seeing how that hero, Irie, navigates all of the personalities and within the organization, and you walk through specific scenarios. I'm wondering, back to when you come into an organization and that there are some players who are not allies, you pick that
Mhm.
up pretty clearly, and you're starting out on the wrong foot with some of these players, especially if it's someone in a more senior level role when you come in. You talk about Irie's experience, but if a new product leader is coming into an organization, they take a look at the landscape, but they're seeing some of those higher level C-level folks aren't buying in. What are one or two things that you'd say they should prioritize first to shift the dynamics with those leaders?
Yeah. One thing we talk a lot about in the book is to really get to know people, to be curious, and finding out about what those people's goals and incentives and motivations are is helpful to understand why they're being a blocker, right? You may be doing something that is against their goals without even
Mhm.
realizing it. You don't know what their goals are. And even if it's somebody way high up that you can't get a meeting with, we actually talk in the book about the idea of an unmeeting, which is a created chance encounter. You can ask other people about that person. You can ask somebody at your level in that person's department, hey, like, how are you measured? What struggles is this department facing? Do you know anything about this person's or blockers? And try to do some research and try to figure out if you can crack the code, as it were, and figure out what they're motivated by. I did this once when I was at Wayfair because the COO had a renewed interest in a topic that I was working on, which was damage reduction, which is reducing the number of damaged items that arrive at customers' doors. And I also had this concept in the warehouse of a directed workflow, right? Where you tell them what to do step by step rather than having them figure it out, which leads to inconsistencies. And so I'm like, okay, how do I get funding for this? I know that this person, this executive is interested in this other thing. How do I connect them? And so what I ended up doing is thinking about a program that we had for an open and inspect program and connecting the idea of a directed workflow to say, hey, if we can decide systematically what should be inspected and tell people systematically what they should inspect or not, then we can reduce damage while conserving operational efficiency. And so they're tied together.
Mhm.
And so thinking about what you feel like is the right thing to do for the customer and what your research shows, if you have an executive stakeholder who's blocking you, figure out, okay, what are they interested in? Does this relate to what they're interested in? If so, how do I tell that story?
Yep, yep. I love, and this comes up, thanks, Melissa. I love also, and I have these conversations with product managers and UX professionals. There's this whole portion of even just the question I'm asking, how do you navigate relationships with C-level folks? It's how you navigate relationships, whether just based on what you said, any relationship you have, understanding the other person's perspective and trying to figure out what their part is, what your part
Yeah.
is, and navigate that. I'm curious, is what do you tell product leaders? Is it very similar there that it's really just about understanding the people you're working with?
It is, right? And sometimes if the person I'm talking to is a parent, I sort of liken it to having children, right? Because how do you explain things to a 5-year-old? Not that your stakeholders are 5-year-olds, but you have to think about what their perspective is and what their life experience is and what they understand and create a metaphor
Yeah.
for what you're trying to explain to what they already understand.
Mhm.
And it's really just about understanding people who are different than yourself and trying to say what you want to say in their words.
Yep, yeah. I appreciate you talking about being a parent where there's this whole notion of being the best parent you can be is all about conscious parenting. I think about being an excellent product leader is conscious product leadership too. So that really resonates with me, Melissa.
Yeah.
Melissa, I mentioned that I'm a big fan of the book, but one thing as I started the book, I read it cover to cover in a night. Stayed up too late. It was fantastic. One of the things I really loved, and it was so refreshing to me, admittedly, as a female product and UX leader, was the discussion that you have a co-author, Bruce, who is fantastic, and you both have different perspectives bringing to a product leadership role. And you actually put in the book that Bruce and I had conversations where you were writing chapters about building rapport, building trust with stakeholders, where you both weren't even aligned in terms of how product leaders should approach the work, given you're a woman and Bruce is a man, and there's many other diverse, inclusive issues. So you mentioned that in the book that you chose not to put in some of these topics, understanding you both had a specific lens that not everyone else could. So after waxing poetic, my question was, I'm really fascinated by understanding your perspective as a woman and a product leader. Are there things you've seen and observed that are different about how you need to navigate an organization versus some others? And if so, what have the differences been?
Yeah, and I will say that Bruce is like a huge ally of women
Yeah.
generally. And he's himself said that he's starting to notice things that he might not have noticed previously. So in another part of the book, that the typical business parable has like a main character and like their mentor who helps them. And so we have Irie, and she's got a number of different mentors. And one of the things that I pointed out that then Bruce was like, oh, yeah, obviously, is that Irie should come with some of her own stuff, right? She
Yeah.
shouldn't be 100% dependent on a mentor or a manager to provide her with things, because she's a mid career product manager and she's got her own history and knowledge. So we put that in. We made sure that she was a well rounded character who knows a lot of things and still has things to learn. And I think that it's helpful to have these different perspectives to make sure that we can see the whole picture. And some things work for some people and some things work for other people. There's some examples in real life where, as I move further on in my career, defining what it means to be a leader. And leadership is not just being the loudest person in the room or being super opinionated or having the final say on things. Leadership can be being really good at those one-on-one conversations before the meeting, so you don't actually have to say anything. And a lot of that leadership is not as visible. And so a lot of more women are leaders in that way than I think men are. And so it tends to have a gender bias in how we view leadership. And so I think in my career, I've learned that leadership comes in a lot of different flavors. And it's helpful for other leaders to recognize that in their peers and in other people to come out in support of more quiet leadership.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Irie, our hero of the story as well. I'm wondering, the way you start out the book, Irie is just starting in the position. So she's understanding the landscape that she's coming into. So for Irie, the protagonist of this story, when she's first coming into the organization, she's strategically thinking about how she's going to spend the first 30, 60, 90 days. When you're working with product leaders in your coaching role now, and they're entering a new organization, where are you suggesting they focus during those first 90 days?
So part of it is obviously getting to know the people they're working with. And I read an article recently that suggested, if you're going into a new organization, which we didn't put in the book, but I thought was interesting, is that you should put together a WTF list, right? Things that you come into the organization, you're like, why in the world would they do it this way? But rather than just announcing it and getting all over it and being like, this is wrong, right? Write it down until you have more information about what's going on behind the scenes, who the people are, who came up with what, right? You don't want to insult somebody by saying something's wrong and they came up with it. So putting together that list, but making sure that you find out more context before actually acting on anything, which I think is related to doing that discovery before you make some of those decisions.
I really appreciate that. I haven't heard of the WTF list. It's something that I could have used really early on, even mid-career. You're talking about putting together that list before you act, and part of
Yeah.
action is putting together that list before you speak.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. I'm curious your take, like, where did you get to that lesson? Did you ever have an experience where you realize, oh, I wish I could have stayed and laid back a little bit before I spoke up or acted?
Probably, but I'm thinking of an example where a new leader in a particular area came in and did not do that and just came in and stomped all over everything. And I'm just like, you don't understand. We've tried this in 4 or 5 different ways. You're just suggesting things we've already tried, and you haven't even asked us what we've tried.
Mhm.
And so it's in understanding how I react to that. I wouldn't want to be that person who just comes in and says, oh, we should do it. This is so easy. We should be doing it this way. And I'm just like,
Mhm.
no, you don't understand how this thing works.
Yep, yep. I love your discussion about when you're also coming in during the first few weeks, first few days, understanding how the organization is structured and the way it's structured and how the organization functions. You also talked about, and this seemed really key, I was curious your take, you talked about power players. So understanding who in the organization, I'll let you define what a power player is, but can you speak to that? Who are the power players and how might you identify them in the organization?
Yeah. So power players are the people who have the authority to come in and make a final decision or reverse something or just come at the end, the old swoop and poop,
Mhm.
as it's called. who can just say, nope, we're doing something different. And so identifying who those people are is really important. And we note two different kinds in the book. One is a dominant function power player, right? Like you say the company is sales led or engineering led or marketing led. And we talk about how to identify those. So who's not in the executive leadership team, but is invited to those meetings anyway, or which function did the CEO spend most of their career in, which function has the most number of high titled people, right? Like who is the most, and then the second kind is the CEO whisperers, we call them, right? Who does the CEO have coffee with? Who are they most likely to be seen walking down the hall? Who's been at the company the longest? Sometimes those people are in lower positions, but like they've been around for so long that people go to them for advice. And it's important to find out who these people are, because if you don't realize who they are, you could accidentally exclude them from something or accidentally upset them. And you want to make sure that you have them on your side.
Yeah, you spoke to who is the CEO going out for coffee with? Who are the informal leaders? Have you also seen, I've also noticed going into organization, who are other employees and other colleagues going out to lunch with and coffee? Is there an informal leader? Do you see that as well? Other behaviors along the way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for all of these things, understanding the organization, understanding who the power players are, if you're new to an organization, find some friends in your own department or in your own team and get their perspective, right? Hey, so and so was in this meeting, which was weird because it wasn't expected. Are they in a lot of meetings that
Yeah.
don't seem like they would need to be in? Or who is this person?
Yeah. I love where I keep saying, I love this part of the book. I love this part of the book. I really did, Melissa. The discovery interviews with stakeholders, as you talk through
Mhm.
that. What I loved about this portion in your book is I don't know how many times when I've talked to UX leaders or UX research leaders who will say, I'm not gaining the traction I'd like in the organization. And we'll be hearing that where your spin on things, where you're saying, if you're trying to understand your organization and the stakeholders, treat it like a research and discovery process. And that's huge.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that, the importance
Yeah.
of that, and how you run those projects?
So I think a lot of people like UX leaders and product leaders, we have certain skill set, but we don't
Yeah.
apply them to ourselves, right? And so if you want to know more about something, treat it like a discovery project, right? Talk to your stakeholders and ask them questions. And you can use a lot of the same techniques as a customer interview, right? Start broad and then get narrower. Don't talk about what you want first, just ask them about themselves, right? Make sure that you're in a comfortable place that doesn't have a lot of background noise so you can talk to each other, right? Don't be weird and have a laptop in between you and take notes and look over the top of the laptop. Think about how you're going to take notes and think about how you build rapport during the conversation and make it relaxed, right? All of those things you would do on a customer interview, you can do with a stakeholder. And the goals are slightly different, but in the end, you're trying to understand their day-to-day job. You're trying to understand their motivations. You're trying to understand how they think and how they make decisions. And you can use a lot of the same techniques.
When you're interviewing these different stakeholders, and I'll give you an example, curious how you'd approach it the same or differently. When a product leader is going in-house and they're interviewing the head of engineering, for example, they're also planning to talk with the head of sales. How might
Mhm.
those interviews be the same or different, and why?
Yeah, I think for the most part, they would be pretty similar, right? You'd ask questions like, hey, tell me about what metrics you use in your department to measure
Mhm.
success, or tell me about how your team is structured. Tell me about your past working relationship with my department. Uh, and I think you can try to use the lingo of different groups, right? Just like on a customer interview, you would use the words that they're familiar with if there's like a regional dialect or something, right? Coke versus soda versus pop, right?
Mhm.
Just to make sure that they understand that you are familiar with their world. But for the most part, I think that a lot of the stakeholder interviews could be a similar set of questions.
Okay. Yep. Yep. In terms of one of the strategies you recommend in terms of getting buy-in and alignment from your stakeholders, you talk in the book quite a bit about workshopping and different approaches you can take to involve your stakeholders along the process. Near and dear topic to me in terms of how do you involve people in the organization in your work. I'm curious your take, Melissa, in terms of workshopping with your stakeholders. I've received pushback from product leaders before about if you're involving people too much in the process, it slows things down. In terms of involving people to the right degree to achieve alignment, let's talk about that. So, where have you found workshopping most valuable and what types of workshops?
Yeah, I agree that if you involve people everywhere and every step in every meeting, you're going to bog things down. It could be like decide by committee. And the product manager should be the decision maker at the end of the day, or the product team. But I think that starting from the beginning and aligning on goals is one of the most critical things you can do, right?
Mhm.
OKRs format kind of works really well. Making sure that you're all on the same page as far as what you're going after, how you're going to measure success, what your timelines are, any of that sort of foundational setup stuff. If you're not aligned with stakeholders on that, then you have nothing to go back to when making
Mhm.
decisions. So if you're aligned that I'm going to focus on A instead of B this quarter or whatever, then when the stakeholder comes back to you, like, I have this idea around B, we decided we're going to focus on A. So that's really interesting. We're going to save that for next quarter. And so having that alignment at the beginning on the foundational stuff helps you navigate the rest of the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I see and you spoke to one of the big benefits of workshopping is to get to that alignment. And that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering too, I'd love to hear your thoughts about product leadership. When I talk with product leaders, they're bearing a lot of weight and a lot of pressure, as you've talked about. They're fundamentally a decision maker in the organization. And I'm wondering, have you had an opportunity? One thing I would think would be a benefit of workshopping is it takes some of the weight off the shoulders of the product leader, getting perspectives from other people. I'm curious your take on that in terms of other benefits there may be to the workshopping.
Yeah, having to do the whole thing all by yourself is one, like a lot of work, and two, you're going to get pushback at the end because you
Mhm,
missed something, right?
mhm,
Product management, product creation is a collaborative, or should be a collaborative process, right?
mhm,
And one of the additional benefits is it's harder to complain about something you helped create. So if you bring your stakeholders
mhm,
in on the process along the way, then they feel some ownership and they feel they helped make the decisions and help guide the team, so they feel a little bit more, okay, I helped with that. So if I complain now, it's complaining about something that I did.
mhm.
You don't have to do it all by yourself. And actually, there's an example of a client that I worked with that made a major change to the roadmap. And I suggested that he talk with the CEO right away about this change. And he delayed it and delayed it until finally it was this like big bang reveal at the end, like the day before engineering was about to start their work. And of course, people had questions, right? It was like the first time the CEO and the head of marketing and head of sales had seen this thing. And it just didn't work out well for anybody. And
Yeah,
he was like, "Why are you pushing back? This is such a great strategy." It doesn't matter how good it is. If they haven't seen it before, they're gonna question it, right? They're not gonna
right.
just say, "Oh, okay, great."
Yep, yep. You spoke to that swoop and poop behavior that you sometimes see from stakeholders. I'm wondering, I sometimes called it the stakeholder torpedo, same sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm wondering for product managers, product leaders who are responsible for overseeing the roadmap. You spoke to this a bit where stakeholders will come in once the roadmap is refined and set and say, nope, what about how can product managers prevent that from happening earlier? And you've spoken to this a little bit, but specific to the roadmap, are there recommendations you have?
Yeah. I think setting up a roadmap process and explaining that is helpful, right? There's phases. There's like a open for comment phase, and then there's a this is what we're doing phase.
Mhm.
If we explain adequately to the stakeholders, like they just want to know how they can help. They have some ideas, they want to bring them to you. If you don't tell them this is the time period in which we're creating this thing and there's open for comment, they don't know that's the best
Yeah,
time for them to.
yeah.
So making sure that schedule or whatever is clear and setting up time with them proactively during that period to say, hey, we're putting together the plan for the next quarter. Wanted to know if anything has changed on your side. Here's what we're thinking about. Do you have any comments? and saying, this is the time that we're doing this.
Hmm.
And then during the kind of execution phase of the roadmap, and this is all happening at once because while you're executing this quarter, you're planning for the next quarter, right? So there's multiple things happening at the same time. But making the process clear then what gets on to the roadmap now that's like truly an emergency and what waits until the next cycle. And if you explain what the process is, here's how I prioritize, here's how I think about value. I use the RICE framework
Hmm.
or whatever to help me prioritize. Then they're like, oh, okay, now I understand how things work. Now I can be more helpful. I can say, oh, here's actually the value of this thing. And here's the external factor that means that we need to do this right now instead of waiting. So
Hmm.
they can come more prepared with their requests to say, okay, I understand how to do this kind of intake process, how you think about things. I'm going to come with the right information to help you make that decision.
Okay. Yep. Yep. I'm really curious your take on something, Melissa. I really appreciated in your book, you were talking about different frameworks and processes to help teams work well together. You brought up the RACI approach, the DACY approach. With DACY, I'm thinking about the way I have thought about it is it sets the tone for who's the decision maker and who's deciding what. Where RACI, it's who does what.
Yeah.
Here's where I have a question for you. One thing I found in an organization when the teams get sometimes bogged down in a racy or daisy and lots of conversation about that. And sometimes I've concluded, and I'd be curious your take, that when there's so much discussion about a daisy, for example, that it's actually an indicator that there's a lack of trust and respect and empathy. You talk so much in the book about the importance of trust, respect, empathy, teamwork. What is your take? Is it essential to go through that type of process to map out who the decision maker is, or what are your thoughts there? I'm really curious.
I do think it's essential to figure out who the decision maker is, right? Whether you go through a particular process or do it in a particular way, I found myself a lot of times we're stuck. We can't figure out why we're stuck. There's a roadblock.
Yeah.
Things aren't happening. Oh, it's because we don't know who makes the decision. And so we just keep talking about it over and over again, and we don't make a decision because nobody feels like they're the decision maker. A decision doesn't get made. And so I found myself a lot of times thinking like, okay, I think this might be the key to unblock us is who makes the decision.
Hmm.
Is it somebody in this team? Is it some executive? Is it me? I don't know. Can we at least agree on who's making the decision so that we can move forward?
Okay. Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I'm sold.
Yeah.
I do think you're right. Absolutely. You really need to know who the decision maker is. I found that conversation has to happen. It's not black and white. That conversation has to happen. If too much time is spent there, I could see it being that indicator that I was talking about, but I'm sold. Thank you, Melissa. Um, okay. There hasn't been a session that's gone by where I don't ask about this topic. It's been top of mind for product UX folks is AI. A lot of people are defining AI as different things, but AI, LLMs, there's a lot of talk in our community, both from a product and UX perspective, about there potentially being possibilities with AI, but there's also some talk from some leaders in our space that this is going to be the age of regret, where there's some doom thinking here. I'm curious, as a product leader, what's your perspective on AI and how it's going to affect things going forward or not?
Yeah. So AI is not something that just happened in the last couple of years, right? Like artificial intelligence, machine learning has been around for decades. But we're talking about it now because of the extreme advances of LLMs in particular
Mhm.
and the kind of accessibility that things like ChatGPT has made it where everybody can now interact with AI. So they're
Mhm.
like, okay, now it's a thing. Everybody's, I've heard of this. We need to do it. But I think there are a lot of amazing possibilities and a lot of time saving. I'm thinking like discovery interviews, right? How much time have I spent like coding lines of transcripts where I could now just ask a chat GPT kind of thing, can you summarize this for me? It might
Mhm.
not be 100% accurate. It might not be exactly what I've done, but it can be done in 5 seconds versus like hours of manual coding. So there are definitely some cool things that we can do with it. I think what I would caution people in is that a lot of teams nowadays have an OKR of build an AI feature, right? Which is really like a hammer in search of a nail. We need to still remember that we need to focus on customer problems and business problems and technical problems. And if AI is a great solution, great. If it's not, maybe we need to do something else.
Yep. Thank you. Agreed. Melissa, can we go back to you shared a lot of excellent insight in terms of the different perspectives product leaders can have going into an organization, thinking specifically about women leaders coming in again. I'm thinking of an example of a product leader who was a woman where she was getting feedback at the C level from different people. Some of the feedback was listen more, stay quieter in meetings. Whereas other feedback was you need to speak up more in meetings, voice your opinion. Contrasting feedback, she's stuck. I know there's no right or wrong answer, but this is flummoxing for many product leaders, especially women, how to navigate a workplace. As a product coach, what do you say to these women leaders? Like, what next?
Yeah, that's an age-old question, Dan. But I would say that building one-on-one relationships with the people who are going to be in the room is helpful because then you can find who your allies are. So I was in a meeting once where there were three of us. It was me and the fellow product manager and like a stakeholder. And I was saying something and the stakeholder was responding by asking a question to my male colleague, right? And it just kept happening. He didn't respond to me, he responded to the guy, right? And so the guy in the meeting, because we had to build a relationship, said, "Hey, that's a great question. Melissa, what do you think?" And so I think that having those relationships with people where they understand you, they understand what you can bring to the table and can pass things back to you or counteract some of that other stuff or stand up for you in conversations where you're not in is really helpful.
Yep, yep. Very helpful advice. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you for all of the time today. This was really an excellent conversation. I learned a lot. I'm recommending your book to all of my friends and colleagues. For those of you
Thank
who
you.
haven't gotten Melissa and Bruce's book, it's fantastic. Melissa, thank you so much for the time today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.